Are we ready?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wine with Rita, a special edition dedicated to fathers. I'm fortunate to have Dr. Ian Zajac, a clinical psychologist based in Adelaide, who is the director of Men's Psychology Clinic. Good morning, Dr. Ian. How are you?
I'm good, Rita. Yourself?
I'm very well. And it's quite interesting how we scheduled our interview today because it's Men's Mental Health Month. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was June until today, half the time. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's there's the month, and then in November we have a fairly big focus on it as well here in Australia in particular.
Yeah. So is this the American month or is it?
I think this is like the International Men's Health Week. Yeah, whatever they frame it. Look, as I said, for me, it's just like men all the time because that's who I work with. So I tend not to follow these, structured kind of campaigns very much. I just get lost with them.
No, I love that there's actually 2 days because I feel as a society we need to raise awareness of something that's such a big stigma,
Yeah,
particularly with men and fathers especially. So let's talk to mental health.
yeah,
Why is it such a taboo with fathers or men in general?
yeah. Look, I'd love to have a clear answer, but I think that our understanding of men and help seeking is a little bit I guess, complicated by the fact that we judge it against the standard that we say is the acceptable standard. And what I mean by that is, if we have, say, half the population women who are very talkative about emotions, they're happy to open up, they form close bonds that engage and build those conversations within them. If men don't do that, and we don't as much, then there's this assumption or presumption, I should say, that that's a problem, and so we kind of think about men not seeking help and not talking about mental health only when we compare it to some standard of behavior that we say is the right way to do it, right? So it's problematic because men do actually seek support, and the literature around men's engagement in healthcare shows, like in terms of any interaction with primary care, at least 80% of men are seeing a primary care specialist every year, right? And I think there's like a 1 or 2% difference, men to women. So men are engaging with the system. When it goes to engaging formally with Medicare or system supported mental health care, there is a differential there. So the system is not working very well in terms of funneling men to it, but it is essentially, as I said, not so much that men won't talk about it. I think it's more that we haven't created the environments and the formats that men will talk about it within. So, going down or playing golf with your mates and having some new
Mm.
guys around is not an environment that you're going to be open up to all the challenges that are going on. Whereas if it's a really good friend, you're out for dinner, you're going for a drive, whatever else, you might have that kind of dialogue. So it's very much moderated based on depth of relationship, I guess the receptive style of the person you're talking to, and when it's necessary, we'll go into it. But a lot of the time, we would prefer not to have those conversations because we might interact with people to get out of that headspace, right? So then we don't want to
Mm.
bring it within that space. So it's really complex. And I think, yeah, overall, the idea men seek help less is not quite factual. The idea that we don't look after our mental health is probably a bit more factual. But again, it's like we do if we're encouraged to and if we're given the right space for it.
I love how you said the space because as a woman, I think when I go out for coffee or a wine with a friend, it's like, poof, here's all
Yeah,
my emotional load. This is what I'm feeling. Let's discuss how we feel here.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I never thought that men would try to retract that. They don't want to bring their burdens to a social event because it's not a healthy space for them.
That's right. I mean, and often I've worked with guys who are just coming out of a separation, so long-term marriage or otherwise. And one of the things that I hear repeatedly is, I don't want to be that guy who every time we catch up with everyone brings up all of these challenges, right? It's not to say that that network is not supportive, and it's not to say that you wouldn't, as the person who's going through a separation, have the conversation with those guys. It's just that you don't want to do it all the time. And, I think that we have same as mothers. You know, for guys, we're fathers, we're employees, we're brothers, sons, friends, you know, like we kind of enact the behaviors within the role that we adopt. And so if I'm out with mates and we're using humor and there's banter and there's all the rest of it, like I'm doing that to get out of the other roles, right? I'm not going into it to relive some of the challenges I might have at work or relationships or family. I'm just like, that's the role I'm doing. It's like an escape strategy.
Yeah, that's so true when they say men are from Mars and women are from Venus, like we're just two different human beings. But I like how you said going to that space, they don't want to be that burden to every single event that they go to. So then
Correct.
shouldn't that then raise the need to having those true, authentic friendships where you can feel safe talking about those repeated concerns all the time?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need to create spaces that we are heard and understood, and that people have a two-way genuine concern for each other. And like there is lots of instances where people are really well socially connected, but the depth of connection is missing. So depth is really important, not just quantity. And the depth is what enables you to say, hey, you know, what's going on here or there. And, you know, a classic example is, you know, in my own life, my brother-in-law works in the mines in WA, and occasionally, you know, I'll just flick him a message and say, you know, how you going? I know you haven't been home for a while. And he's like, yeah, all good, not great, home soon, whatever. It's like, we've created that space because we have a really strong bond. And that depth is more important than quantity, as I said. So we don't, you know, the check-in is important, and the opportunity to voice distress or whatever else is important. Whether we leverage it or not is very different across men and women, I think.
Definitely. Now, I wanted to touch base, like we're speaking about men in general, but let's now talk about when a man's transitions into different parts of their life. So, for example,
Yeah,
fatherhood. Now,
yeah,
as a mum, that's a complete 360 turn. Your
yeah.
social circle changes, your identity changes, your relationships change with different people. How is that change, or how does that change significantly impact a man?
There's more and more research focusing on the transition to fatherhood, and particularly there's been some looking at kind of first-time fathers and that initial transition. And anyone who's been there, I've got two boys, they're adults now, thank God. But you know, like you can be as prepared as you think you need to be, and then what actually happens is entirely different, right? So
Yep.
it is a big culture shock. I think everyone moves into that space of their life with an idea of how it's going to play out, and the reality 9 times out of 10 is very different. So there is a kind of impact, I guess, on sense of self, and also, you know, what defines you as a person before you're a father and after you're a father. And the evidence shows that as men kind of move from school to middle age to older, we have these real fluctuations in terms of social connectedness, mateship, engagement in hobbies, interests. Like all of that varies and is particularly impacted by a big transition like fatherhood, be it first time or, you know, having multiple kids. I remember both of my boys were in sort of sport and dance at some point, and we were out like 5 nights a week at training. Both days of the weekend we were doing sport or dance or whatever else. And it's like my wife and I just, you know, tag team all of that responsibility. So we both had a cost. We both wore a cost as part of that parenting. So men do wear a cost, but I think because of, you know, particularly the kind of maternity leave versus paternity leave differences here in Australia, men may have that opportunity to leave that sort of family home and have that adult time out at work a bit more frequently than some women do.
Yeah.
And so there's certainly a difference there. And, you know, I mentioned before about us essentially role playing. So when we're an employee, you know, we're not dad anymore. Like that does happen. We'll get a phone call and whatever else, but go to work, we switch off for 8 hours, we go home to a partner that didn't get to do that all day. So there's a lot of conflict, but certainly everything changes for both sides.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you touch base with the transition to difference of expectations and so forth.
Yeah.
Now, what's the mindset like of from a male's perspective when the expectations of what fatherhood could be like, particularly when their child has a diagnosis? What feels does that bring up for a dad?
I did go looking into this just recently around men's perception of caring for children with special needs versus children, typically developing children. And one of the things I think that certainly came out in that qualitative data was that men tended to feel the need to be more protective of a child with special needs than are typically developing. And that, some of the guys sort of talked about giving a typically developing child more space or more time, or kind of maybe slightly looser boundaries, in the sense that you're encouraging sort of autonomy. So if a child is having issues with tying up their shoes, for example, you might really sort of push that behavior till the child's, really dysregulated by it because they can't do it, as opposed to, say, a child with special needs, you're just going to jump in and tie the shoes up straight away. So there was some differences there, I guess, around that sense of protectiveness and providing across the two children. But at the end of the day, the outcomes that men desired for kids were the same. So the way we approached care, varied a little bit, but you viewed your children to be very much the same, those with special needs and those typically developing. So the feels in terms of having a child with a disability is, I guess it depends how you frame it up. People often talk about a sense of either confusion or loss, or what does this mean, when either you have a child who is diagnosed with something, maybe further down the developmental period as opposed to at birth. But more and more, like particularly in like the affirming movements that we talk about reframing disability as just difference, I think people go through that period of, thinking about what is this, potentially from a loss or a sadness perspective, to let's just view this as a difference and capitalize on strengths and move forward in that context. And I think, both men and women probably have a similar experience around how they process those sort of topics and those issues when it comes to children, particularly around diagnosis.
Yeah, it's true. And I guess when you said being protective, I never thought of it from that perspective. I thought of it from they're probably more take on a different role where they would step back and let the mother do the most of the intervention, or even mum knows best, I'll just sit back. And I never thought of it from the protective perspective as well.
Yeah, look, I think in terms of like mum knowing best or mum doing best, not to be too controversial here, but and I'll always find a meme that like connects and it actually makes sense to me. And there was something going around recently, which it was a man and a woman, and she was like, he never does anything. And he was like, I can never do anything right. So the easiest way to navigate that dynamic is to actually not do anything. All right. So I think when it comes to, some of that perception of maybe the mother doing more for a child with special needs, that may well be the case. But the issue isn't necessarily that the dad doesn't want to or can't or doesn't know better. Sometimes the difference is that discrepancy in what one partner thinks or how one partner thinks something should be done versus the other, and having difficulty navigating that difference. And I think if you want people to contribute more broadly, as a couple within a dynamic, you really need to be able to navigate those issues more so than I'll just do everything and you don't do anything. So it's complex.
You said that it's not like dads don't want to help. They do want to help. But the question is, how can we encourage them from their mindset to let them help more, particularly with their child with special needs? And the reason why I touch base on this, there's a lot of evidence that has shown when fathers are more involved with their child's intervention, there's better outcomes for the child from an intervention perspective, but also the overall family well-being. So there's less maternal depression, marital satisfaction, the couple are more in a union together. So I guess there's more positives when the dad takes on the load, but we also need to recognize that the way that fathers process their child's difficulties is very different to the mother or the wife's perspective too. So from a clinician's perspective, and when I have a family-centered approach, it's about how can we work together to meet both genders and their needs, but also ultimately support the child too.
Correct. And I think that, you know, what you just mentioned there around a child with special needs having better outcomes when dads are involved, and then also that family life is better, the marital relationship is better, right? The individual well-being is better, kind of to me reflects maybe a more functional dynamic overall. So it isn't necessarily the case that when you look at a male who's involved versus a male who isn't, that the only difference is the willingness of that male to be involved. You know, it's kind of like, as I said before, having those conversations around what each person views as, you know, necessary or not, in terms of structure versus unstructured. You know, like I know some people, it's like we get home at 5, we eat at 5:30, the child's bathed at 6. You know, I'm reading a story by 6:15, and if you're like 10 minutes out of that window, everyone's dysregulated. You know, me personally, I'm not particularly structured with my life, never have been. So if I was like 6:15, I've got to have this baby in the bath, you know, and if my wife was hell-bent on that being the case, it would have been an absolute disaster, right?
Yeah.
So I probably just wouldn't have done it. But if it's like, yeah, between 6:30, I try and get a kid in the bath, great. Like, we need to have flexibility with how we navigate these things, and flexibility with the standards that we apply. So what you might like to do with your child versus what I might like to do with that same child are going to differ, right? And that is okay. But what matters is that the two people or more, depending on the family structure, can converse about how they will jointly navigate that, right? So that links into that concept of better relational satisfaction, better personal well-being. It's really about the unit working cohesively together.
And I like how you said that. It's really important that we emphasize the importance of conversing with one another and
Exactly.
knowing what your expectations are. But you said
Yep.
before, when the baby's young, dads had that escape. They would go to
Yeah.
work, mothers are home. So that's their kind of respite. And I'm a true believer that when a person looks after their own personal well-being, they can pour
Yeah.
into their family cup better.
Yeah.
Now, I deal with many families, and I know that the load of having a child firstly, but then the load of a child with excessive needs,
Yeah.
it's a lot for families to take.
Yeah.
What strategies could you suggest from a mental health perspective to support men so they can pour into their family, not only to themselves, but also to their family and their partner's life too, better?
Yeah. I think we have to look at the different ways that we regulate. And it would be no different to how you might look at a typically developing child and one with special needs and how they regulate, right? We need to look at genders in a similar fashion. So for men, they would typically report, you know, doing something physical, be it not necessarily exercise, but, you know, maybe you're out mowing the lawn, you know, weeding the garden, whatever it is you enjoy to do, go ahead and do it, right? We use physical movement and distraction as primary coping mechanisms. And that distraction, you know, links back into, as I said before, when we go and see mates, we're not going to mates to have a massive conversation about how poorly we're doing. We're going to mates to have a distracting experience from the normal. So we leverage distraction and we leverage activity. And we do that in order to kind of be in a more level-headed space, which means better well-being and more capacity to show up within a family unit and do things more. Women, on the other hand, will, you know, definitely use the same sorts of strategies, but based on my clinical experience, I would say they might typically leverage connection more as a coping strategy. So as you said, you catch up with a friend for a coffee or a wine, you guys info dump, you know, and it'll go from everything to everything from being completely unrelated to how you're going to how you are going, the child and the partner and the family, right? Like, that's how you do it. It's still an activity that is unique to you. And I think what we have to do to support each other in a partnership is understand that a behavior that you do is not, or I shouldn't see it necessarily as, you know, a waste of time or unnecessary or whatever. without understanding the function and the context of it. So when we think about a behavior, same as when we work with young kids, what is the function of the behavior? What does it achieve for the person? And if you have, a dad who's looking after their well-being, and that involves whatever it is, like use a real typical example, playing footy on a Saturday with mates, you might, or you could perceive that as being a selfish thing to do because you're not connected with the family. But it's actually a very helpful thing to do if we look at physical activity and distraction as primary coping mechanisms. So we have to think, what is the function of the behavior? How do we facilitate it more when the function is useful? And same for your partner. You really need to be thinking about, how does my partner, particularly, early days when my boys were born back in the late 90s, I didn't have any paternity leave. So my partner was home from day one. I would approach it very differently now with a slightly more mature headset than when I was, an 18-year-old. But, she really needed the opportunity to go and do her thing as an adult, as an independent woman, right? Not tied to children. And I think enabling that is, and as I said, going down and seeing friends and having a coffee on a Sunday afternoon, and I'm at home with the kids, you can get really a lot of friction in those sort of dynamics, but I've got to see the function is for her to regulate and look after herself. And if she can do that and I can do that, then when we come together, we're all going to be a much better functioning unit. So the difference is really important, right, between how women and how men cope, and understanding the function of the behaviors, and then having the conversation and providing, I guess, the framework within which you can do those things in a supportive way rather than it cause friction.
I like how you said that. You said understand the behavior that's linked to the reason as to how they can regulate, or is a coping mechanism for them. Interesting. Because I feel like in my group of girlfriends, like, oh gosh, he's watching TV again, or he's got out to watch footy again. Watching footy, cricket, golf. Like, how many sports can men watch? But I just see it as their respite, but really it's their coping mechanism to deal with the load, so they can show up better for their children and for their life at home.
Yeah, but there might be better ways to do it. Like, that's the only thing, and that's the caveat around this is, like I mentioned previously about the need to be flexible with each other and within a family unit. We also need to be really flexible with behavior. So when a behavior becomes predictable, like if every Saturday, every Sunday, all day, every day, your partner is just sitting in front of the TV watching the footy, even from their own individual perspective, I would argue that's not particularly helpful. All right.
Yeah.
So we need to be flexible, meaning that there might be a way that you could meet your needs that doesn't involve all of that time, potentially disconnected from family, for example. So, we have to be able to identify multiple ways of looking after ourselves and flexibly shift through those depending on the demands of life and parenting and family at any given time. Because as I said, the way I regulated when my kids were infants versus when we were at sport 7 days a week, obviously have to look entirely different. And I didn't have the time for, my own really kind of engaged hobbies or engaged interests and whatever else. So I had to find different ways to do it. And that's where we can get stuck when we're very rigid about how we cope. We need to think, how else can we get a behavior that's functional to help a person get to that end goal of regulation or whatever it is?
Ian, I'm actually thinking, because with NDIS, right, we have these expectations that a child has a diagnosis, they need to access speech, OT, and all these allied health services, but we never see the need to access services from a family-centered approach to help parents out. We're just, you and I are now discussing the strong evidence of when families are more present and connected and working together, there's better outcomes. Why aren't we moving down the direction of including this, would you call it psychology or even marital support with supporting a child with a disability? What would you classify it as? I really feel like any family with a child with a diagnosis needs this included in their plan, because we know the outcome will be better.
Yeah, so look, within NDIS, your psychology support comes under capacity building. And I'm not so sure how it works with the early intervention stream, sort of pre 7, 8 years. I can't remember what it is now with NDIS. But
changing to 9.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can never keep up, the same as you.
No.
But certainly, like if I see an adolescent, or particularly younger adolescent who's supported by NDIS, then I'll have far more interaction with their caregiver or parent than I will with an older person. But under NDIS, we can actually work with a significant other, i.e. mother or father, and not the client present. But I think understanding what you can and can't leverage funding for is really important. And I would say if you have capacity building and you have a mental health OT or similar, or even, depending on the goal, if it's speech related, a speech therapist who's working with mum and dad so that everyone is on the same page and understanding how to get somewhere, I think that is something that is supported by NDIS, but maybe just less known in terms of how we structure those and bill and everything else, those appointments. Medicare has actually moved towards allowing parents to have sessions about children funded by, not entirely funded by Medicare, but with a proportion funded by Medicare, as opposed to the traditional model, which requires the patient there. So before the change, a child had to be present in, say, a psychology appointment.
Is that the
In
mental
order,
health plan?
yeah, it's related to the mental health plan, but
Mm.
the item lines differ. So you can now have parent focused sessions, because at the end of the day, a child, if you think about locus of control and what you can and can't do to regulate and everything else, then a child doesn't have a lot of that, right? So
Yes.
it exists within a dynamic of a family, and the primary point of intervention, even for mental health, is always family-based intervention. So NDIS, Medicare, I think they can support that. We just need to creatively recognize how to do that in those funding streams. But certainly, like, relationship is key. Relationship is number one thing, that if that's not working, everything else is going to fall down.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, I want to touch based on where you said it's about conversing with one another. Now, my business
Yeah.
is all about connection creates communication, and
Yeah.
without connection, it's really challenging to set up the communication with others. Now, we know men and women converse differently. Women, as we said, are very verbal diarrhea, and men are avoidant.
Yeah.
What strategies can you support partners to allow them to create that space so they can discuss how they feel without that stigma attached to it or judgment?
Without the stigma and judgment, I think it's really important about context and picking the right time. So, it isn't uncommon for me to see a guy who comes into therapy and a big part of what's going on is a dysfunctional relationship in the background. And so we will talk about the importance of difficult conversations as we usually discuss them, because a lot of the unhad conversations are the very difficult ones, right? Topics that are going to be triggers and whatever else. So we sort of talk about the TLC method, which is first and foremost thinking about the time. Like, so if you're talking about a day, what is the best time for you to show up in a conversation? For me personally, I am an ADHDer, so I don't function well at all before about 10 or 11 a.m. Okay. Often my time, if my wife wants to have a real planning or other conversation with me before that, my brain is just literally not working. Okay. So the time for me, like when I feel most functional from a pure circadian rhythm or whatever else perspective, is like afternoon, right? Or maybe even late in the evening for me. So time is really important. If it is naturally a bad time for a person, do not have a difficult conversation then, right? Location is the next thing. If we are in a space that is, for me, a reminder, or my partner a reminder of all the things we haven't done yet, it's going to be a competing demand. And our brains are primarily a limited resource system, meaning that we can only do so many things. And the more we load it, the more it's going to dysregulate. So if you're trying to have a difficult conversation in a location that is problematic because kids are around, chores
Don't
are
be at
around,
home.
whatever else, it's not going
Don't
to
be home.
work. All right.
I know.
And then the third part for the TLC is curiosity. You really have to approach the conversation with curiosity. And that has to do with not just trying to understand your position on something, but more so understanding the other person's position and perspective. So, it's really around that curiosity and connection almost that you sort of talk to. We have to be able to have a time and a space and a connection to be able to do conversations well, because and I often reflect on this, for a species that is so verbal, we actually
Mhm.
communicate really poorly, in my
Why
experience.
is that? Why is that? I'm curious. Why? Because I'm. Why is communication, from the psychology perspective, why is communicating hard for people?
I
If there's no
think,
associated disorder, obviously.
well, with or without a disorder, right? Like, communication is primarily a behavior that we use, I think, to make sense of. Like, if we put communication in the context of well-being, mental health, emotion management, or whatever, communication gets needs met, or it it kind of problem solves, works through things. And so if we have people, in my experience, that have been brought up in contexts, family environments, and other school environments, for example, that don't encourage and don't facilitate and don't enable people to learn how to talk about difficult things, then we simply don't have the skills. And I often think with guys, like, people have often commented to me that guys don't talk about emotions, and there's only some truth to that. I would say you should sit in my clinic room and you would think very differently. What guys aren't practiced at doing is talking about very difficult emotions in either with their partner or with mates. And so it's kind of like expecting them to speak a foreign language when they've never had a lesson, all right? And that is
Yeah.
certainly going to fall over if you haven't got the time, the location, and the connection curiosity right, because I can't do it. I just can't do it. So I'm going to avoid it and back out of it. But if you're
Mm.
encouraged to do it and you learn to do it, like any other skill, we get better at doing it. So we have to, when, to your point of why don't we do it when it's so important, I literally think we need to view it as a skills deficit.
And this is why there's such a big push with the
Yeah,
emotional intelligence with young kids now, and allowing them to develop their emotional vocabulary to a point that they do not avoid those challenging conversations when they are adults, and they can openly express what they're feeling
yeah,
rather than avoiding when they're
yeah,
older. But this all comes back down to childhood and the importance that we allow our
yes,
children to express themselves and allow them to be in their own emotions and so forth. Like all the trauma stuff that we always talk about, and
yeah,
how it's important to address that and heal yourself
yeah.
before yeah.
But even in the absence of trauma, right? So if you can have a really otherwise healthy, functional, dynamic family, whatever, and not do repair very well, right? Or connection very well. It's not so much that you've had a traumatic experience, it's just that you've had one that processes emotions in a very different way. Maybe it's pull your socks up, try a bit harder, whatever else. But, and just to mention that concept of flexibility before, I do think that we also need to be mindful of the fact that if we are well versed in communicating emotions, that that's not the only thing we should always do when things are difficult. All right, because there are contexts within which, if I'm not coping well, or my partner or whatever else, voicing those emotions right then and there is actually not a helpful thing. All right, we need different ways of coping, but we need to build in the capacity to have the conversation about them. So kids need to learn to talk about it. They also need to learn different ways of coping with upsetting emotions that don't involve talking, but doing
Ian,
both.
this is just fascinating stuff. Like, I love this stuff. I find it changes my way of practicing with clients, but also relationship with other people. It's riveting stuff. Keep up the great work. Love it. Love it. We spoke about when dads have their escape time because it helps them with coping mechanism. Can you suggest any other practical strategies to help support fathers' mental health in their family home too, apart from the exercise and doing their boy time? Because
Yeah,
I think the media is all about mindfulness, meditation, and all of this stuff to do. But what
yeah.
more? I cannot see my husband sitting there coloring a mindful book, or sitting there talking about. He would just look at me and say, "What's wrong with you, Rita? Like, this isn't me." So,
Yeah.
what practical strategies can men implement?
Look, I often think about as I said before, depending on your phase of life, the way you cope is going to look different, right? So if I have a family situation within which maybe my partner is working weekends and I'm, Monday to Friday, so I'm not getting that time for distraction and whatever else, that is alone time. How do I do it with family, right? How do we make that a shared experience? So maybe, you've gone down fishing down the beach with your kids, or you're kicking the footy, or you're going for a bike ride, or you're walking the dog together, or you're out with your kids having coffee or whatever. Well, not coffee, hopefully, depending on the age. But how do you do physical, distracting, other things that are good for your mental health with the family, with those people? Because I think that is a big friction point, is we are naturally creatures of habit. So when we are at a point where we can't do habit anymore, firstly, we're really bad at identifying an alternative. But second, we're likely to get quite frustrated and in an unhelpful kind of conversation or otherwise about why you're not letting me watch the footy on a Saturday when you've got 3 appointments with the kids and you've got to do all this stuff, right? We have to be flexible and identify that we need to cope a different way. So I think dads need to think about leveraging distraction, leveraging physical activity, leveraging, the concept of a flow experience, which is something you do and that's all you think about. It's the same as distraction. How do you do it with kids? How do you do it with your partner? How do you do it in locations that are better for your mental health than locations that are bad for your mental health? And that comes same to those conversations we said. If I am trying to, for me personally, if I'm trying to, look after my well-being and mental health, then sometimes being at home is not the best place for me, because, I have a habit of starting all these projects. So there's a lot of unfinished projects everywhere. And I'm just like, oh man, there's so much work I haven't done. I need to get out. All right. I can do that alone. I can do it with a partner. I can do it with kids. I can do it with friends. How do we, interact with family and create a way of coping together? Because you're actually teaching kids as well how to cope in doing that, rather than it being a you thing and the mum thing and the kids are just the middle ground.
You frequently mention doing things together with the family and not keeping it separate. What's the evidence that's linked to the importance of a father in the role of a child, particularly when they're growing up into becoming a young adult themselves? What's the evidence related to that?
The evidence really comes from the broader understanding of how role models influence behavior and development more broadly. Like, we're very much monkey see, monkey do when we're kids. We learn through observation and we mimic behavior. So if we have, and particularly male figures in your life, but also, mothers, but when we're talking about male figures, if we have males that are not necessarily particularly functional when it becomes to coping with emotions, coping with difficulty, navigating conversations, having difficult conversations, kids just learn to do what they see. So I always think about, because often people come in to see me and go, oh, look, the relationship's on the rocks. It looks like we might separate, but I'm really worried about the kids. And there's this perception that you must be together for kids to be healthy and happy. It's not true. There's no evidence to support that. What is important is that kids are, they feel safe, they feel connected, and they feel, supported and valued. You can do that as a live-in couple or a separated couple. So what matters most is how you role model behaviors. And for men, I think, my generation is born, 1980. We sort of, what I viewed from my father, and he's a wonderful dad, is very different to what my boys viewed from me and what I now see boys viewing from newer dads, right? So we're changing very much what we view fatherhood to include and what those behaviors include. So role models are super important. And, I just think about, if you didn't have a good role model, what kind of characteristics would you have wanted in a role model? And can you demonstrate those? Or if you did have one and it wasn't a dad, but it was an uncle or a brother or a friend's dad, how do you, live that out a bit better yourself? So super important, but, it's more complex than sort of just being present or not separated. It's tricky space.
And I like how you said it's about being the parent that you want your child to observe, but also become, because they learn from you too. It's funny because I'm just going to say a personal story. So my daughter was going through something really challenging yesterday, and we discussed emotions and how we can problem solve it and so forth. And I was actually telling my husband, I would never have had this conversation with my mum. It would have just been dismissed because grow up, it's okay, there's nothing to worry about, you're living, you're breathing and so forth. And I think that comes back down from a cultural perspective.
It does.
But then, and when my daughter, it's just like she has that open space to talk about her feelings, and it just made me have that bit of a proud moment that her emotional needs are being met that way.
Yeah. And that's a good example, I wonder with you, Rita, whether that's a behavior that you wished you'd been able to enact as a kid with your own mother. And if it were, I mean, like, it's not that you probably a good example. It's not that your relationship with your mother wasn't great, and I don't know if it was, but if it wasn't, but it lacked something, you know, that is something that you can do in addition to all the other great things that your role model did for you. And that's a good example of enabling that, you know. And cars are great places to have conversations with kids, because, you know, going back to that idea of conversation, we're really bad at conversing when we're face to face with people.
It's true. It's like eye contact. It's like this force that you cannot talk. But where someone's speaking to the back of your head, it gives them that barrier to feel safe, I guess.
Well, I think that, but also it has to do with that resources model that I mentioned, right? If we're looking at one another, and particularly like me and the teenage boys, when they were younger, like the best places we had conversations were in the car, and that's because we're not listening to verbal information and processing non-verbal information to understand what's going on. Because I could perceive in my younger son, for example, that he's getting really frustrated, which he does and did quite frequently. And that would trigger a response in me that would impact the conversation. But if we're not looking at each other and he has that response and I don't react to it, then the conversation keeps flowing, right? So we're kind of just reducing the amount of resources needed to just focusing on the verbal aspect and our own experience without having to be like, what's that meaning? How come you're looking at me like that? Don't do this, you know, like it's so, And I think same in therapy, within therapy, same with couples, like the classic example is like date night, sit across the table, have a conversation, but also like just going for a drive, like chat next to each other, side to side. It's very neutral.
Definitely. It definitely shows the importance of understanding each other and creating that space that's right for time, location, and presence as well, for deep connection.
Rita, I just have to plug my headset in.
Sure, go for it. We're just about to finish up it.
Oh, well, we should be right then, because I'm really worried when I plug it in, everything's just going to break, because that's usually what happens on the computer.
So before I finish, I always ask my guests to pick a word of the day to help them be a better version of themselves for tomorrow. So the last, I've been quite sick the last few days. So the word that I always tell myself is patience. Be patient to yourself and kind to yourself, and not to push yourself, because the version of you next week will be better because of that. So what's your word of the day, Ian?
Look, I would probably say perspective, but based on the conversation today, I would actually say flexibility. And I think that's really important for families with kids and structure, because sometimes the adherence to structure and routine and how we've always done things is part of what's not working, right? So like flexibility with how we approach things, how we interact, your view of things versus mine, what I need to do versus what you need to do, how this child copes versus this child. Like we need to think more about, like, you know, being flexible in how we enable each other to meet needs.
This is wonderful. Flexibility, definitely love that word. Perspective and flexibility, great. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for giving me your time.
Thanks for having me.
Your wonderful word of wisdom. It's incredibly insightful, and I hope that it helps couples, but in particular fathers, to show up better and be better to their partners, but also to their children.
Yeah, same, hopefully.
Have a gorgeous day, and we'll catch up soon. Take care.
Thank you.